Thank you, Madam Speaker. The focus areas of this legislation are about child safety, about regulatory integrity, and about efficiencies and alignment with national frameworks. Some of those are matters that are set to be addressed upon commencement. Other matters are delayed, like clauses 29 to 38. My colleague, the member for Fanny Bay, has already neatly summarised a lot of the strengths of the legislation. And part two, the matters that would come into effect after assent on information sharing, strengthening integrity and national consistency are broadly agreed upon by everyone as a good step forward. And the part three, clauses 29 to 38, measures on mandatory registration for early childhood teachers, likewise agreed upon as useful, albeit matters that will be addressed a year or so from now. I am grateful to the Legislative Scrutiny Committee as well for their work in this space, and I had the opportunity to read the majority report and the two additional, as the member for Johnson would have it, reports, and I think it's great that there was an expansion of the scope for looking forward to what we might do in this space to be constructive. I think the reason I've chosen to speak tonight is because this bill, in isolation, isn't particularly controversial. There are small things that can be refined. There are 1 percentile improvements, perhaps some 5 percentile improvements. But I rose tonight to speak because I think it's important to honestly recognise that this is a piece of the broader puzzle to improve public education and education outcomes in the Northern Territory. And at the risk of being contrary on a bill where there is broad consensus that we will support it, to not just extend platitudes, not just to recognise our schools and wonderful educators, wonderful though they might be, but actually to do a little bit of a stocktake and see where this fits in the broader picture. Because the fact is, our public education system is not tracking as well as we would like it to track. And I think we are on the verge of significant changes at the moment. Next year will be a major year in education reform, and it's important for us to put these matters in context to understand where we're at and where we go from here. Now, this government is trying very hard to strengthen teacher workforce, and it is committed to attracting and keeping teachers through all the work that it's doing, to fixing education, and very directly to getting kids back in school. Honestly speaking, all the gnashing of teeth about the 1 percentile stuff that I hear from some of the concerns about the bill are no longer of concern to me in the broader equation. What I'm more interested in now is how we start turning public education around, given that actually we can keep on saying, you know, this 1 percentile will improve things, but actually there are broader structural forces that we need to address, and we do have to have some eye to history and what has been happening in education for the best part of a decade now. Now, streamlining the processes and reducing administrative obstacles are really important. The member for Fanny Bay has outlined how some of that will happen, as with strengthening of regulatory integrity and the mandating of registration of early childhood, and again creating national consistency and improving information sharing, all of which I applaud. I'm all for doing things that bring us into accord with the national standard. Child safety will be strengthened by mandating professional registration for qualified teachers. We will introduce and strengthen child safety by improving information sharing with other jurisdictions, and that will prevent harm in the long run. And the bill will strengthen regulatory integrity by tightening up things to do with the TRB, the Teacher Registration Board, albeit there are, again, concerns about the centralisation of power and decision-making in some regards. Now, here is a sad, but, well, perhaps not sad, here is a reality check for everyone. The centralisation of power is happening the world over, parliaments over, across Australia in actual fact. And to some extent now, I'm less about fighting it the whole time and starting to think about, okay, well, if we are going to centralise power and mechanisms, then how do we still ensure we get good outcomes, or quite frankly, better outcomes than we've been getting? Because we have tried a number of we have tried a number of mechanisms now to try and create all of the rigour in the world, and actually I'm not just concerned with respect to failing our educators, as it was put by one of my colleagues, or to one teacher, one profession, but to thinking more generally about concerns with the education system writ large. Now, as I said, alignment with the National Framework for Teacher Registration, great thing. Again, amendments in the bill to ensure Aboriginal languages are captured as a specialist subject, a great matter. And the amendment recognises the importance of Aboriginal teachers and the teaching of students in their first language, and it supports those flexible employment options for remote schools. Again, flexibility, there is an interaction here with flexibility in the labour market for us. We have to actually start thinking in a place of small population and limited options about how we create regulatory efficiency by reducing administrative burden. So there are a number of interactions here. This isn't just a bureaucratic piece about registration and child safety. It's part of the broader ecosystem of understanding where our public education system is at. And this bill will streamline registration processes, and thereby it will create some flexibility for employers to seek authority, for example, to employ an unregistered person to teach specialist subjects, which is important in the vet space, which is important for individuals working towards gaining teaching qualifications. Now, look, all of this said, the question might be, well, why is this of such interest to me? Well, it's of interest to me not necessarily because my electorate is one replete with schools. The fact of the matter is my electorate has very few schools, but they represent the polarities of our system, and they represent and illustrate neatly some of the systemic problems that we have at the moment. So on one end of the spectrum, I have a school like Haileybury-Rendell School, a high-performance private school with fantastic opportunities for its kids. You know, in addition to delivering high on core curriculum, it has all manner of extracurricular options available to people there. And it's been my great pleasure to be involved with that school and to be able to do high value-adding tasks there where I can and to be part of their community and contribute where possible. But the extent of my interaction, or our interaction with them to some extent, is about preventing things like the Berrima Road duplication to ensure that the school is not disrupted. But on the other end of the continuum, I have a great investment in public education, as many of you know, and as I've said before, I'm the product of 5 public schools in the Northern Territory. And the fact is, the equality of opportunity that I got going through schools historically, like Anula and Karama and Sanderson and Casuarina, gave me a fair go to realise my own potential. And that was the case for generations past. And I'm not convinced it's the case for generations going forward now. And there is ample evidence to suggest that's the case. And that's why we have to be making the kind of moves that we are making in these kind of spaces to try and think in a more agile way about, well, how do we attract and retain teachers? How do we integrate better with our labour market? How do we actually deliver for not just educators, but for kids? Because right now the numbers don't make for great reading. And the numbers don't make for great reading based on 15 months of what this government has been doing. The numbers don't make for great reading based on the last 10 years of governance in this place. And in that regard, I have to be honest, I'm getting frustrated with the platitudes. I'm getting frustrated with treating the Labor government of the past like it has a monopoly on being able to provide solid educational outcomes. In actual fact, the parlous state of the public education system is a product of the last 8 years' worth of Labor governance. And I think it's time to start facing up to that reality. Now, as I said, Stewart Park Primary School, one of my schools, excellent school, regarded, and I say this tongue-in-cheek, but slightly, in jest, but also semi-seriously, something of a Labor fortress. It's been a school that has been very socially progressive in many ways, but it is absolutely a school that is wonderfully led by Maria Albion. It is invested in continuous professional development. It is a place of significant, long-standing experience, dedicated, experienced staff, right? It is a place with stable enrolment numbers, consistent attendance in advance of 90%, in fact, at that school. It's even got a great school band, which I'm looking forward to playing with very much tomorrow at the music assembly, right? The fact is, it is an aberration. It is increasingly an aberration in our public schooling system. And when you look at the numbers and when you start looking at the metrics, you start to realise just how much damage has been done to our public education system and why there is a growth in independent and private schools in this place. Now, I'm not anti-private schools. I represent the elite private school in the Northern Territory, arguably, Haileybury-Rendell School. And it's a fantastic school, fantastic opportunities, well run. I'm 100%, The other day, they had the surplus capacity to be able to take out Year 9s for Wellbeing Week to clean up trash in Charles Darwin National Park. Really great activity to be part of. But they also have fantastic numbers and scores and test results across the board. They are not failing our kids educationally. It's not just about infrastructure, it's not just about registration of teachers, it's actually about the end result outcome for kids. And I don't believe that at the moment we are facing up to the reality of that situation. And I think, as I say, in speaking about this today, it's an opportunity to face that reality as we move forward into a next phase of educational reform, which has been necessitated by the fact that we have dropped the ball on public education in particular in the Northern Territory over a long period of time now, and certainly over the best part of the last decade. Now, what are examples of that? Well, at a very basic level again, if I talk about that primary school that I was at the very beginning of the year, that was a school, for all its successes, that didn't have working locks and keys and doors for basic security in its upper primary school. Now, the agility, and I thank the Minister for this, her responsiveness resulted in me being able to resolve minor capital works, and I'm grateful for her responsiveness and swift resolution, because the fact is those are not the kind of issues that schools should have to be wrestling with. They're just not. And so basic infrastructure deficits, as you know, that's just the tip of the iceberg. We can be talking about the fine details of, like, as I said, I read the additional reports, and the additional reports point to extra things that we could do in relation to teacher registration. But we have a bigger problem here, and the bigger problem is a function of educational failures by the previous government over the best part of a decade. The numbers just speak for themselves. That's the honest truth of it. The numbers speak for themselves. When Labor came to power in 2016, school attendance rates were on the other side of 80%. By the time they had finished their 2 terms of governance and been voted out, attendance had fallen to almost 70%. That is a significant metric. Again, we're worried about 1 percentile teacher registration stuff. Yes, it matters. But look at the bigger picture here. Look at the bigger picture of what needs to be done to create the architecture of opportunity in the Northern Territory again, because otherwise you are missing the wood for the trees. The fact is, after years of inaction by the former Labor government, the CLP government is actually progressing some pretty important secondary school reform, which is long overdue. Like a good half of us in this House are people who were beneficiaries of the old education system that provided that architecture of opportunity before we had the middle school rollback. And now, I don't want to hear it when it's going to be a case of you're rushing it, it's too fast, we can't keep up with it, how will we implement this? It's already overdue. And we won't compromise educational outcomes, but at the same time, the fact that a lot of this stuff is happening quickly and with a higher risk tolerance is because we recognise that this reform is necessary to create opportunity in the Northern Territory again. Yeah. That's the reality of it. To create opportunity in the Northern Territory again, you must actually invest in the things that work and take some chances. So far, there have been no great mistakes or missteps made in that space. And I say that particularly so in the education space. Another one, Minister Hersey presented a petition for 940 people to the last Parliament calling for a dedicated special needs school for residents in Palmerston and the rural area. That was not a bad idea then, and it's not a bad idea now. And I'll have plenty to say when it comes to budget time and how we spend our money, but that's a good investment. That's a good investment, but it was not a suitable investment for political expediency purposes at the time. And now we are investing in something that actually makes sense in that regard. I don't even want to talk about the intensive support role, but the fact of the matter is, if you look at the numbers, they, again, speak for themselves. They were clearly used to make attendance figures look better than they were. And we're being transparent about those figures now, and I think it's important that we face up to what those numbers say. And it is pleasing that in Term 3 of 2025, we've seen 300 plus fewer kids on the ISR compared to a year ago in Term 3 of 2024. You know, we are increasing accountability mechanisms for parents whose children consistently fail to attend school. Will all the policy levers that we pull work? No, I don't actually believe they will. But will more of them work than if we just sit around twiddling our thumbs? Well, that I do believe is the case. And that's why I'm backing the totality of the package of educational reform being driven by the Minister. The CLP government has committed $1.9 million to, for example, employ school counsellors based in schools. We know we have, proportionate to our population, more public servants than anywhere else per capita. And we know that education is one of the spaces where it makes the least sense to have a concentration of people in Mitchell Centre when you actually need a bunch of people out in the ground in schools. And the school councillors is an example of a good initiative in that regard. But look, the very worst of it all in my mind is the fact that under Labor, Territory kids have lagged behind the rest of the country when it comes to literacy and when it comes to numeracy. And that's why I don't want to be harsh about it, but we just cannot continue to all dance around those figures and talk about the 1 percentiles. You know, 1/3 of all NT students are categorised now as needing additional support in literacy and numeracy compared to 1 in 10 nationally. When I went to school here, when the Leader of the Opposition went to school here, we went to school in places that were proportionately per capita funded better than anywhere else in the country. We essentially had a public schooling system that was the envy of the rest of the country. We made prudent use of the money that we were gifted by the federal government in our education sector. And that's the great irony here, because yes, it is true that the former Labor government was able to secure money from the federal government, its fair share of the pie, as with everyone else. But then what did they do with it? What did they do with it to result in that standard of lit numbers falling? You know, our NAPLAN results under Labor showed 58% of all NT students, including 85% of Indigenous students, didn't meet basic literacy and numeracy standards. And that is why we have a focus on getting kids back to school via $14 million boosting literacy and numeracy plans, including, you know, embracing a consistent evidence-based approach centred around explicit teaching. It hasn't been pulled out of nowhere. It works elsewhere. The data and the evidence was out there. If the former government wanted to do something about it, they could have done something about it when they were in power, and they did not. Madam Speaker, the bottom line is the days of viewing public education as the remit of Labor, they're over. They're over in this place. I'm done with hearing about it. The fact is, whilst no doubt getting a cut of our National Education Accord, they have actually overseen the decline of public education in the Northern Territory. And there are innumerable fronts on which I could detail the argument, but one of the most compelling is the actual aggregate enrolment data in those last 8 years of governance. So if you go back to 2016, going with Term 1 data, there were 33,300 kids in schools, right? And then if you go to 2027, it goes up to 34,400, 2018, 34,300, 2019, 34,200, 2020, 34,500. It stays roughly consistent. But in real terms, what that means is it's declining. And in that period, whilst Labor are failing our public education sector here, the private sector is having to pick up the slack. But the real telling data is when you start looking at what happens in the second term of the Gunner government. Look at that period of time, and what you'll see is a persistent decline in enrolment numbers. It goes from, in 2021, 34,600 to the following year, 34,400 to 33,000 to 32,000 to 32.5. Why has that happened? It's not proportionate to or commensurate with our population growth. It's not to do with that. It's to do with falling standards in our public education system overseen by the last Labor government, by the failure of the previous Labor government to actually manage the money they were given, to actually produce better educational outcomes for our kids. So all of this tinkering and additional reports, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything when there have been declining standards, declining numbers, and a declining architecture of opportunity. And that is what I'm really interested in here. The fact is, the architecture of opportunity in the Northern Territory has comprised, since the beginning of the setup of this place, public health, public housing, public infrastructure, and public education. Fail on those things, and you fail to grow the territory. You failed to grow the territory. I'm done with the historic romanticism and romanticisation rather and revisionism. Make no mistake, the erosion of that architecture is the product of Labor's poor choices over a decade. And it is the reason that there are 17 of us here and 4 of them left over there. That's the reality of it. The erosion of the architecture of opportunity. Now, returning to the teacher registration bill from earlier today, I'm not going to say that it's going to correct all of the failures in the education system. It's simply not, let alone all the structural failures created by the government, the Labor government, over the last 8 years. But it is a step. It is a step, and it's a step in the right direction. And it's one of many that this government is going to have to take in order to bring that architecture of opportunity back into accord, and in order to bring public education standards at a junior level and at a secondary level back to scratch. And it's an important time to be taking these steps, because 2026 is going to be an extremely significant year in education reform. The long overdue rectification of the middle school transition, the necessary moves in child safety improvements, and the strengthening of regulatory integrity, they are all long overdue. Now, this government is acting to improve public education, not just dealing in platitudes and feel-good stories and talking about the virtues of education in the abstract, or our wonderful teachers. Yes, our teachers are wonderful. My teachers were wonderful. My father is a wonderful teacher. But I'm done with hearing the stories about wonderful teachers being the be-all and end-all of our system. There are systemic failures here that have made it impossible for our education system to succeed, and those systemic and structural failures must be addressed, and I believe will be addressed by this government going forward. The Minister in the ministerial report that we spoke of in the last parliamentary sitting said, and I wrote it down because I thought the quote was a good one, quote unquote, "Departments have had to be agile over the past year to set things in place. We have not just talked about it, we have acted." And that's what it's going to take now. So the gnashing of teeth, as I say, over the 1 percentile stuff, whilst virtuous, is the enemy of the good at this point, as far as I'm concerned. The prevarication and the bureaucratisation of public education in particular, but the education sector writ large, is a significant problem in the Northern Territory. And we may end up having the same conversation in regards to what Labor did with health, to what Labor did with public infrastructure. And we can keep talking about it, or we can do things about it, and that's what the government is getting on and actually doing. So I support the moves being made by the Minister for Education in this space. I think that we are taking calculated, positive chances to move things forward at a pace that they need to be moved forward now, because, quite frankly, we're watching otherwise a slow-motion spiral, and public education is not going to remedy itself. Public education and the education sector in general is only going to get back on its feet if we intervene and actually stimulate the sector at this point. So on that basis, Madam Speaker, I look forward to continuing the process of righting the wrongs done to public education over the last decade, and I commend this bill to the House.